The wind in the Arizona Territory, late in the autumn of 1881, was a living thing. It had no pity. It came down from the high wall of the Mogollon Rim, carrying the taste of pine and distance. But by the time it hit the floor of the Salt River Valley, it was just a dry, scouring force. It whipped the red dust into a fine mist that settled on everything, filling the folds of a man's shirt, the creases around his eyes, and the quiet spaces in his soul. It was a land that demanded patience, and it gave nothing back for free. Jonah Calder knew the wind. He knew the dust. He had come here to escape noise, and this land offered silence in abundance. He was a man made of quiet corners now. The war had taken his fill of shouting and sawing. He had been a surgeon in the Union Army, a man who had put hundreds of men back together and signed the papers for thousands more who couldn't be. Now, his hands, which had once held scalpels and sutures with grim precision, were stained with beeswax and leather dye. He kept bees and he made saddles. The work was honest. It was solitary. It was enough. He rode his Appaloosa, Comet, along the thin ribbon of green that was Tonto Creek. The horse's hooves made soft thuds in the damp earth near the water, a welcome change from the hard pen of the open valley. Jonah was checking his hives, the white boxes tucked into the lee of the cottonwoods and mesquite. The bees were his congregation, their steady hum a better sermon than any he'd ever heard. He was calculating the last harvest before the real cold set in. Maybe 10, 15 pounds of dark, rich honey from the fall bloom. He smelled it before he saw it. It wasn't the sweet, dusty scent of the chaparral or the sharp green of the creek willows. This was an acrid tang, the smell of scorched cloth, blistered paint, and something else. Something heavy and spoiled that the wind couldn't clean. Jonah pulled Comet to a halt, his hand moving not to his hip, but to his nose, rubbing it as if to wipe the smell away. He tasted ash. He looked east, away from the creek, about a half-mile off, where the land broke into shallow arroyos. A plume of greasy black smoke had stained the sky earlier. Now, it was just a haze, and circling above it, a dozen dark specks, vultures. They weren't just circling, some were landing, heavy and impatient. A cold knot formed in Jonah's stomach, a feeling he recognized from fields like Antietam and Gettysburg. Trouble. He turned Comet's head, nudging the horse into a slow walk toward the smoke. He didn't unholster his revolver. He was a beekeeper now, but his thumb rested on the worn wooden grip of the Colt, a habit forged in a past he couldn't entirely shed. The wreck was a missionary wagon, or what was left of it. It had been run off the trail into a ditch. One of the large rear wheels was shattered. Its spokes snapped like kindling. The wagon bed was tilted at a sharp angle. Its canvas cover burned away to black, fluttering rags. He saw the amateur repair on the front axle, a clumsy bracing of baling wire, and felt a pang of pity. These had been people trying to hold things together with hope and scrap. The black paint on the wagon's side was bubbled and peeling, revealing the scorched letters of a slogan, "Is Love." The fire had eaten the first word. He dismounted, the creak of his saddle loud in the sudden, oppressive quiet. The vultures were the only sound, their low hisses and the flap of their heavy wings as they hopped back a few yards. Angry at his interruption, there were two of them, men, dressed in the heavy black coats of preachers or clerks. They were face down in the red dirt, perhaps 20 feet from the wagon. Jonah walked over, his boots sinking into the soft dust. He didn't need to be a surgeon to see they were dead. But the surgeon in him couldn't help but observe. He knelt by the first man. He didn't turn him over. He didn't need to. He saw the dark, ragged hole in the back of the coat, just below the shoulder blades. He saw the man's hands, pulled behind his back. The wrists were raw, rubbed bloody by rope that was now gone. He moved to the second man. The same, executed. This wasn't a raid. This was a culling. They hadn't died in a fight. They had died after they were caught, helpless and bound. Jonah stood up and scanned the ground. Boot prints were everywhere, heavy-soled and purposeful, the tracks of shod horses. They had come, done their business, and left. He felt the familiar, weary anger that came with waste. Two men, dead in the dirt, for whatever trinkets they carried in a wire-bound wagon. He was about to turn away, to ride to Payson Crossing and find Marta Leland, the town marshal. It was her business, not his. He was just a beekeeper. Then he heard it. A sound so small the wind almost carried it away. A faint, wet rasp, a hitched breath, like a bellows with a hole in it. Jonah froze. He listened. The wind whined. The vultures shifted. And there it was again. A desperate, shallow wheeze. It was coming from the wagon, from underneath the tilted, blackened bed. His blood ran cold. He drew his Colt, his body dropping into a crouch, the muscle memory of war taking over in an instant. He moved low and fast, using the broken wheel as cover. He peered into the dark space beneath the wagon bed. He saw nothing but shadows and debris. "Who's in there?" he called out. His voice was rougher than he intended. The sound stopped. The silence was absolute. Terrified, Jonah holstered his weapon. He was a doctor, not a soldier. Not anymore. He unhooked the oil lamp from his saddle, struck a match against his buckle, and cupped the flame to the wick. A small, yellow light pushed back against the gloom. He knelt, holding the lamp low. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice slow and even, the way he spoke to a new swarm, gentle and calm. I saw the smoke. He pushed the lamp into the darkness under the wagon. The light found her. She was pressed against the far side, half buried in spilled sacks of flour and scorched blankets. A girl. No, a young woman. Maybe 19, maybe 20 years old. She was Apache, Chiricahua, by the line of her jaw. Her face was a mask of dirt, ash, and dried blood. A deep gash ran from her hairline to her eyebrow, swollen and purple. But it was her eyes that held him. They were black, depthless, and fixed on him with a terror so profound it had burned past screaming and into a silent, feral readiness. She was a cornered animal, and he was the new threat. His light moved lower. He saw what held her. An iron shackle was clamped around her left ankle, a heavy, brutal piece of metal, the kind used for transport. A short length of chain ran from it, bolted to the wagon's floorboard. The skin around the iron was rubbed raw and bloody. Jonah pulled his head back out, breathing in the clean, sharp air. He stood up and walked a slow circle around the wreck. The tracks told the story. The shod horses, the heavy boots. And one set of tracks. A man with a distinctive limp, dragging his left foot, wearing a boot with a worn-down heel. Jonah had seen that boot print before, outside the general store in Payson. It belonged to a man named Ransom Pike. Pike was a trader, but he didn't deal in pelts or whiskey. He dealt in salvation, or so he claimed. He ran a school for captured natives, funded by churches back east. He called them his wards, brandishing papers signed by some corrupt judge in Prescott, claiming he was civilizing them. In truth, he was a slaver, selling indentured servants to ranches and mines that didn't ask questions. Jonah looked back at the wagon. Pike's men must have been transporting her when they were ambushed. Or maybe Pike staged the entire thing, collected the bounty on the dead preachers, and left the girl to die. Chained to the wreck. It didn't matter. The result was the same. She was dying. He returned to the opening. He unbuckled his entire gun belt, the heavy Colt and the row of 44 cartridges, and let it fall to the dust with a soft thud. He kicked it away, where she could see it. He knelt again, holding only the lamp. "My name is Jonah," he said. He held up his hands, palms out, showing they were empty. They were calloused from the draw knife and the hammer, stained with propolis. "I am not with them. The men who did this, they are gone." She watched him, her chest hitched with another painful breath. "Water," he said. "You need water." He went to Comet, unhooked his canteen, and brought it back. He didn't slide it to her. He knelt, uncorked it, and took a long drink himself, letting the water spill down his chin. He corked it again and placed it on the ground, just inside the shadow. "It's clean." He sat back on his heels. He waited. The sun was touching the mountains. and the air was growing cold. 1 minute passed. 2. The vultures were creeping closer again. A hand darted from the darkness. It was small, caked in black grime, the nails broken. It snatched the canteen and disappeared. He heard her drink, a desperate gulping sound, followed by a racking cough that sounded like tearing silk. "Good," Jonah said softly. "Good. Now, the hard part." He went back to his saddlebags and pulled out a canvas roll. He unwrapped it, revealing his tools. Not doctor's tools, but his leatherworking tools, and one long-handled hacksaw. He brought it back, holding it up for her to see in the lamplight. "This is for the iron," he said. "I have to cut the chain. It will make noise. I won't touch you." "Only the chain." She stared at the saw, her eyes widening. She understood. She pressed herself further back, if that was even possible. "It's the only way," he said. He set the lamp down where it would give him light. He took a breath and slid his shoulders and torso under the wagon bed. The space was tight, choked with the smell of her fever, the metallic tang of blood, and the stale scent of spilled flour. He was inches from her. He could feel the heat rolling off her skin. He shuffled on his belly until he could reach the chain. He avoided looking at her face. He focused on the iron. He found the link, a thick, hand-forged piece of steel. "I am starting," he whispered. He set the teeth of the saw against the metal. He pushed. The sound was a violation. A high, grating shriek of steel on the steel that echoed in the confined space. It vibrated through the wagon frame, through the dirt, and into his bones. The girl whimpered, a low, animal sound of pain. "I'm sorry," Jonah grunted, pulling the saw back, pushing it forward. "I'm sorry. Almost there." He worked with a steady, grim rhythm. Saw, pull, saw, pull. The metal was hard. Sweat dripped from his forehead, stinging his eyes. The sound was a curse, a long, drawn-out scream that seemed to keen for the 2 dead men outside and the dying girl beside him. Each stroke was a word. Pike, ransom, Pike. The name ground itself into the metal with every pass. It felt like an hour. His arm burned. His knuckles were raw. The girl had gone utterly silent, her breathing so shallow he feared she had stopped. "Just a little more," he said, more to himself than to her. He put his weight into a final push. The high-pitched scream changed to a sharp crack. The link snapped. The chain fell away, hitting the axle with a dull clank. He dropped the saw and pulled himself out, backing away on his hands and knees. He emerged into the dusk, coughing, his shirt soaked with sweat and red dust. He stood up, breathing in the cold, clean air. He looked back at the wagon. "It's cut," he said. "You're free of it. You can come out." He waited. Nothing moved. He could still see her eyes, 2 black spots of terror in the shadow. She wasn't coming. She was trapped by more than the iron. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He walked to Comet and pulled his bedroll and a blanket from his pack. He returned, placing them on the ground a safe 10 feet from the wagon. "It will be cold tonight," he said. "Colder than you think. I'm riding home. It's not far. I will leave these and this." He pulled a small tin of honey and beeswax salve from his pocket, the kind he used on his own cracked hands, for the cut and the iron. He looked at the wreckage one last time. "My ranch is 2 miles up the creek. Follow the water. There will be a lamp in the window." He turned his back on her, a deliberate act of trust. He picked up his gun belt, strapped it on, and swung up onto Comet's back. He did not look back. He nudged the Appaloosa into a walk, the steady rhythm of the hooves counting out the seconds, leaving her alone with the dead men and the choice to follow. Jonah rode into his yard as the last light bled from the sky, turning the rimrock purple. The lamp in his cabin window was unlit. He swung down from Comet, his body stiff. Not from the ride, but from the waiting. He had left her. He had given her the choice. And he knew, in this hard country, that a choice given to the weak was often just another burden. He tended his horse, his movements automatic. He filled the trough, brushed Comet down, his mind replaying the shriek of the hacksaw. He had left the blanket and the salve. He had done what he could without taking her choice. But the silence of the yard felt heavy, accusatory. He walked to his cabin, a small, sturdy box of pine and river stone, and he saw her. She was not on the porch. She was 20 yards away, a shadow against the deeper shadow of his workshop, the bee house, as he called it. She was standing, leaning against the wall, watching him. She had followed the creek. She had seen his lamp, or perhaps just the promise of his house. She had the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a dark shroud. She looked like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt. Jonah stopped. He did not approach. He merely nodded, a single dip of his chin. "The porch is dry," he said, his voice flat, carrying in the still air. "The wind will pick up." He went inside. He lit his main lantern, the one that hung from the center beam, and turned it low. He lit a second, smaller lamp and placed it on the floor near his open door, casting a rectangle of yellow light onto the porch boards. He was making his hands visible. He was showing her he had nothing to hide. He moved to the hearth and stirred the embers. He added kindling, then a log. He swung the iron kettle hook over the flame and added water to a pot. He took down a sack of fine-milled cornmeal and a jar of his own dark autumn honey. When the water was hot, he stirred in the meal, making a thin gruel. He added a large spoonful of honey. It was food, but the honey was also medicine, the same thing he used to pack a wound on a horse or himself. It would fight the infection he knew was brewing. He poured the gruel into a wooden bowl, found a spoon, and took his medical roll. He stepped back to the doorway. She had moved. She was on the porch now, huddled in the farthest corner, as far from his door as she could get while still being on the raised platform. She was using the porch post as a shield. Her eyes, in the lamplight, were fixed on him. He set the bowl, the spoon, and his medical supplies on the porch floor. Then he backed away, all the way to his hearth. "That's for you," he said. "Food, and I need to see the wounds." She didn't move. "The iron," he said. "And your head? They are poisoned." He waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The gruel would be cooling. He sat at his small table, his back to the door, and began to sharpen a leather knife. The shing, shing, shing of the stone, a steady, non-threatening rhythm. He heard a scrape, the bowl being dragged across the wood. He heard the clink of the spoon, hesitant, then faster. He kept his back to her. He heard a low moan, a sound of relief so deep it was almost pain. When he turned, the bowl was empty. She was back in the corner, the blanket clutched tight. "Now the wounds," he said. He picked up the small lamp and his medical roll. He did not walk to her. He sat on the threshold of his own cabin, placing him lower than her. He opened the roll. Clean linen rags, the beeswax salve, a bottle of carbolic wash. "This will sting," he said. He poured a little of the carbolic on a rag and held it out. "I must clean it." She stared at the rag. He saw the calculation in her eyes. Flee, or risk the sting. But her leg, he could see, was trembling. The fever was already in her. She slowly, agonizingly, extended her leg from under the blanket, pushing the torn fabric of her dress away from the ankle. It was raw, a bracelet of ruined flesh where the iron had bitten. Jonah worked quickly, his hands clinical, the surgeon taking over. He cleaned it, his touch firm but impersonal. She hissed when the carbolic touched the open flesh, her entire body tensing, but she did not pull away. He spread the dark, honey-based salve over the wound and wrapped it in clean linen. "The head," he said. This was harder. This required him to be close. He moved toward her, slowly, on his knees. "I am just a doctor," he whispered, though he knew the word meant nothing to her. He held up the lamp. The gash on her forehead was matted with blood and ash. He cleaned it with the same detached efficiency. She watched his face, not his hands. He felt her gaze like a physical weight, searching him for any sign of deception, any hint of the men who had put her there. When he was done, he tied the bandage, his fingers brushing her hair. He pulled back immediately. "Done," he said. He retreated to his cabin, Sleep. The porch has 2 ways off. I will be in here. The door stays open." She didn't sleep, and neither did he. He sat in his chair, watching the rectangle of light, until the shadows in the corner of the porch finally stilled. The fever took her proper on the 2nd day. She didn't move from the corner, and her breathing grew shallow and fast. Jonah moved her then, or tried to. When he touched her shoulder, she came up swinging, a rock clutched in her fist, her eyes blind with delirium. He backed off. "All right," he said. "All right, we stay here." He brought his own bedroll out to the porch and laid it near her. For 3 days, he lived on the porch with her. He kept a bucket of creek water, cooled in the shade of the bee house, and changed the cloths on her head. He forced sips of water and thin, honeyed broth between her cracked lips. He sat with his back against the cabin wall, his revolver on the floor beside him, watching the horizon not for her, but for whatever shadows might have followed her. And in the long, quiet hours of the night, when the fever was at its worst and she thrashed against invisible chains, he spoke, not to her, but to the darkness. He took out a small, leather-bound book from his shirt. It was worn, the cover soft as old skin. It was his wife's journal, May. He read from it, his voice low, a quiet rumble in the night. He didn't read the hard parts, the entries about her sickness, the coughing that stole her breath. He read the simple things. September 4th, saw a red hawk take a snake. Jonah says the bees are slow this week. Blames the lack of rain. I blame his mood. Baked 3 loaves. 2 for us, 1 for Marta. He read her descriptions of the flowers, her frustration with a stubborn goat, her simple, clear love for the sunlight on the canyon wall. He read it to remind himself of what gentle things sounded like. He read it to fill the silence with something other than her pained breathing. He never touched her, except to lay the cool cloth on her forehead. His hands were medicine, nothing more. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He woke to find her watching him. Her eyes were clear, and they were terrified. He sat up slowly, keeping the bedroll over his legs. "The fever's gone," he said. She stared at him. Her lips moved, dry and cracked. "Water," she whispered. He pushed the canteen to her. She drank, her hands shaking. She finished and looked around, her eyes tracking the exits, the yard, the creek. "Pain," she said, touching her head. "I know," Jonah said. "It will ease." She watched him for a long, silent minute. Then she said the 3rd word. "Go." Jonah nodded. "You can," he said. "When you're strong, you are free to go." She tried to sit up, to prove she was strong now. She made it to her elbows before a wave of dizziness sent her slumping back, a look of profound, frustrated anger on her face. "Not yet," Jonah said softly. He stood up. "Rest. I have work." He didn't make her an offer. He didn't ask her to stay. He just went to work. For 2 days, he worked near the cabin. He sawed planks of cedar, the sharp, clean scent cutting through the dust. He planed them. He hammered. The sounds were loud, purposeful. She watched him from the porch, her suspicion growing with every hammer fall. He was building something, a box, a cage. He worked from dawn to dusk. On the 2nd evening, he finished. He had not built a cage. He had enclosed the small, 3-foot-deep alcove on the other side of the porch, next to the chimney. He had built a room, small as a pantry, but it was solid. He had used the sweet-smelling cedar. He had cut a small window high in the wall, too high to climb through but enough for light, and it had 2 doors, one opening onto the porch, and a second, new door, cut into the side, that opened directly to the yard. He walked up to the porch. She tensed, pulling her blanket tighter. He stopped, holding a small, newly fitted brass latch in his hand. "Your room," he said, gesturing to the structure. He walked to the main door of the new room. He knelt and affixed the latch. He fixed it to the inside of the door. He stood up and stepped back. "It locks from within," he said, "and a second door. To the yard. For you." He left her and went inside his own cabin. He did not see her inspect it. But the next morning, when he rose, the porch corner where she had camped was empty. The door to the new room was closed. He began the ritual. He would prepare food stew, biscuits, more gruel, and bring it to the porch. He set down a small stool to act as a table. He would knock 3 times on her new door. Food, he would call. Then he would turn and walk away, retreating 10 paces, sometimes more, and busy himself with a task. He would mend a hive frame or sort tools, his back to her. He would hear the click of the latch, the scrape of the door. The tray would be taken. Later, he would hear the door again. By evening, the empty bowl and plate would be back on the stool. This was their language. 3 knocks, 10 paces, an empty bowl. He left other things. He went to his wife's trunk, a place he had not visited in over a year. He pulled out a thick wool shawl, a bar of lye soap, and a simple wooden comb. He placed them on the stool one afternoon, separate from the food. He did not say what they were. He just left them. The next morning, they were gone. He did not see the shawl. He did not ask. But he knew they had been accepted. A week passed. She was growing stronger. He saw her, sometimes, standing in her private doorway, watching the bees or the mountains. She was still a creature of shadows, but she was healing. One morning, he was at the woodpile, splitting the day's kindling. It was a cold morning, his breath fogging, the axe blade biting deep into the dry juniper. He was absorbed in the rhythm, the thwack and the split, when a shadow fell over him. He stopped, the axe halfway through its swing. Sachi was standing there. She had come out of her room and crossed the 20 feet of yard. She wore the blanket like a cape, and he saw she had used the comb. Her black hair was no longer a matted tangle, but was pulled back, emphasizing the fierce, strong lines of her face. She was thin, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes were alive. They were clear and hard as obsidian. She looked at the axe. She looked at the pile of unsplit rounds. Then she looked at him. She said nothing. Jonah said nothing. He stared at her, waiting. She bent down, her movements still stiff, and picked up a piece of wood he had just split. She carried it to the lean-to by the cabin door and stacked it. She came back, picked up another. Her arms were weak. The pieces of wood were not large, but he could see the strain in her shoulders. Still, she did not stop. Back and forth she went, from the pile to the lean-to. Jonah turned back to the block. He raised the axe and brought it down. Thwack! He split another. He set the 2 halves aside. She came and gathered them. They worked. The sun rose higher, warming the air, melting the frost on the water trough. The only sounds were the sharp crack of the axe, the scuff of her worn boots in the dirt, and the soft placement of wood on wood. They did not speak for an hour. It was the first day they had spent together in the light. They were 2 people, sharing a task. The silence was still there, vast and deep as the territory around them. But the meaning of it had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear, or the silence of sickness. It was the silence of work, and in the Arizona territory. That was the only kind of peace that lasted. The wood stacking was the first brick laid. The silence that followed was not empty, but a space they were learning to fill. Work became their conversation. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the yard. The 3 knocks, 10 paces rule faded. The door to her cedar room was now often left open, and she took her meals on the porch, in the sun. Jonah's world was one of precise, quiet tasks. He brought a torn saddle blanket to the porch, the wool frayed by a branch. "This needs mending," he said, holding out a heavy steel needle and a length of waxed thread. He didn't ask. He stated a need. She watched him. He showed her how to push the needle using a leather palm guard, his large, calloused hands moving with a surgeon's economy. He made 3 stitches, the thread pulling the tear together neatly, like sewing a wound, he said, more to himself than to her. But it must hold strength. He left the blanket with her. He went to his bee house, his workshop, and the sound of his planing knife filled the air. A long, rhythmic shush of blade on wood. When he returned at midday, the blanket was mended. Her stitches were not as straight as his, but they were tighter, smaller, and locked with a small, intricate knot he didn't recognize. It was, he thought, stronger than his own repair. He began to teach her the things he knew, and in teaching, he found himself talking more than he had in a year. He brought out a length of rope. "A beekeeper's knot," he said, his fingers deftly looping the rope. "It holds tight, but you can undo it with one pull, even with sticky hands." He showed her twice. She practiced, her smaller, quicker fingers fumbling at first, then mastering the logic of it. She learned the saddle stitch for mending leather, the right way to hold the two needles, passing them through the same hole. His workshop became a shared space. It smelled of wax, honey, sage, and sawdust. "The smoker," he explained, holding up the small metal can with a bellows. "We don't use it to make them sleep. We use it to make them busy." He stuffed it with dry sage and pine needles. "The smoke makes them think the hive is burning. They go to the honey, start to eat, in case they have to leave. A full bee is a calm bee." He lit the smoker and handed it to her. "Just a little, gently." He went to a hive, a tall white box humming with life. "Watch." He lifted the lid, and a cloud of bees rose, their tone angry. He nodded to Sachi. She puffed the sage smoke, a fragrant, white cloud. Over the top, the angry hum changed, deepened, and the bees settled. He pulled out a frame, heavy and golden, covered in a moving carpet of insects. "See," he said, "they are not angry, they are occupied." She reached out a hesitant finger, not to the honey, but to the back of a worker bee. She touched it, a brush so light the bee didn't notice. She looked at Jonah, a flicker of wonder in her dark eyes. She, in turn, began to teach him. Her knowledge was not in books or tools, but in the world itself. One afternoon, he was looking at the western sky, a high, clear blue. "No rain for a week," he said, sighing. She came to stand beside him, not close, but parallel. She sniffed the air, turning her head. "It will rain," she said. He looked at her. "There are no clouds. The clouds are not the first sign." She pointed to the ground, to a patch of wild, silver-green mint growing by the creek bed. "Smell." He bent. The mint was sharp, aromatic. "I smell mint." "No," she said, with the patience of a teacher. "We always smell mint. Today, the smell is low. It does not rise. The air is heavy. It holds the smell of the earth down. The rain is pushing." She looked back to the sky, narrowing her eyes. "The wind will change. The clouds will come from the south. High, thin, like a scraped hide. Then the water." He watched her. She spoke with an authority he had never heard. This was her workshop. The sky, the plants, the air. 2 days later, after the high scraped hide clouds appeared from the south, the rain came. They grew accustomed to each other's presence. The cabin was small, and when the days grew shorter, the work moved inside. He was mending the shingle roof on the bee house one afternoon, the sun warm on his back. He had stripped off his shirt, the linen sticky with sweat. He was reaching, hammering a loose nail, when he felt her eyes on him. He looked down. Sachi was standing in the yard, holding a bucket of water she'd brought from the creek. She was not looking at his face. She was staring at his chest, at the puckered white scar high on his left side, just below the collarbone. It was an old wound, a gift from the war, a mine ball that had passed clean through. She did not look away, did not show any modesty or shyness. She looked at the scar the way she had looked at the mended saddle blanket, or the way he studied a cracked hive frame. It was a piece of history, a fact. Her gaze was clinical, curious. He stopped hammering and slowly, self-consciously, picked up his shirt. "An old argument," he said, nodding to the scar. She walked closer, stopping at the base of the ladder. Her English was growing stronger every day, built from the words on his seed sacks, his tool catalogs, and his quiet speech. "The argument," she said. "Did it win?" Jonah paused, the shirt halfway on. "I am standing here," he said. "No." She was not confused. She pointed. "The hurt. Does the hurt stay?" Her question was so simple, so direct. It cut through the scar tissue of years. He had been asked about the war, about his service, about the battles. No one had ever asked him about the hurt. He thought of May, of the field hospitals, of the men he couldn't save. He thought of the two preachers in the dust. He sat down on the roof edge, his legs dangling. "The hurt goes," he said, his voice rough. "It fades, like a sound you can't quite remember." He touched the scar. "The mark stays. The mark stays to remind me." "Remind what?" Jonah looked at her, truly looked at her, at the healing gash on her forehead, at the raw memory in her eyes. "To remind me to keep the person in front of me safe," he said. Her gaze held his. She nodded once, a slow, deliberate acceptance of his words. She left the water bucket by the ladder and walked back to the cabin. That night, the first true cold of winter swept down from the high country. The wind was a knife. Jonah built up the fire in the hearth, the logs crackling, sending orange light into the small room. He sat at his table, oiling a harness. The door to her cedar room was open, but she stayed inside, in the cold. "Sachi," he said, his back to her. "It is cold. The fire is warm." He heard no movement. He finished his work, cleaned his hands, and sat in his one good armchair by the fire, reading an old almanac. The silence stretched. He heard a floorboard creak. She was standing in the doorway of her room. She was wrapped in the wool shawl, but she was shivering. He did not look up, but gestured to the other chair, a simple three-legged stool, on the other side of the hearth. She moved slowly, like a deer approaching a salt lick, and sat. She held her hands out to the flame, the light catching the fine lines of her palms. He pretended to read, after a long time. She spoke, her voice quiet. "Your hands." He looked up. She was pointing at his left hand, which rested on the arm of the chair. It was scarred, calloused, the knuckles swollen. "They are hard," she said. "A working hand." "They are," he agreed. She looked from his hand to his face. "Can it hold small things?" The question was strange. Intimate. He wasn't sure what she meant. He looked down at his rough hands, stained with dye and marked by 100 small cuts. He thought of the scalpels he used to hold, the tiny, delicate sutures. Then he smiled, a true, small smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dark shape. He laid it in his palm. It was a queen bee, one that had died at the end of the season. She was perfect, her body a delicate, banded armor. He cupped his hand, his rough fingers forming a gentle cage. "She was a queen," he said. "She made the whole hive." "Yes," he said, looking at Sachi. "They can hold small things." He laughed then, a short, rusty sound, surprised it had come from his own chest. The lessons began. She pointed to his cup. "What?" "Cup," he said. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth and, on the smooth, worn wood of the table, he wrote the letters. C-U-P, cup. She traced the letters with her finger. "K," she said, her voice hard. "P, cup," he repeated, softening the sound. "Cup." She tried again. The end of the word was softer. She pointed to the chair. "The fire." "The door." He wrote each one. Chair, fire, door. She learned them, her mind quick, her tongue slowly finding the shapes of the new words. She was hungry for them, as if each word was a piece of armor she could wear. One evening, as he was cleaning the charcoal from the table, she began to humming. It was a low, sad tune, a melody that rose and fell like the wind outside. "What is that?" he asked. "It is a sleep song," she said. "For a child, a Chiricahua song. It's beautiful," he said. She looked at him, a rare, shy look. "I sing it. You sing." "Mio, no," Jonah said, shaking his head. "I have a voice like a rusty hinge." "Sing," she insisted. She sang a line, a few simple, guttural, and beautiful notes. He tried to repeat it. The sound that came out was awful. It was flat, clumsy, half groan and half note. He knew it was bad, and he winced. Sachi stared at him, her face blank. He thought he had offended her. Then, her lips twitched. A small sound escaped her, a puff of air, and then it came. She laughed. It was not a giggle. It was a full, clear, sudden laugh, a sound like creek water breaking over rocks. It startled him, and it startled her. She put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide, as if she had released something she meant to keep caged. He stared at her, his own heart suddenly lighter. Then he smiled. It was that bad. She laughed again, nodding, the sound uncaging itself for good. It was the first time. It was an unlocking, a key turning in a door that had been rusted shut for them both. He tried the line again. He was still terrible. And she was still laughing when the wind gusted, rattling the windows. The wind had changed. It was no longer the dry, cold air of winter. It carried a new scent, something green and wet. It was the smell of the first rains, coming early. Jonah stepped outside. The wind was from the south. He sniffed. He could smell the wild mint. She had been right again. He looked at his hives. The low, contented hum was louder tonight, a deep, resonant vibration. It was the sound of a hive full of ripe, capped honey, the bees working double time before the storm. It was a sound of completion, of readiness. He looked at the dark, roiling clouds gathering over the rim. A storm was coming, a big one, and he knew, with a sudden, cold certainty, that the hives were not the only thing it was coming for. The larder was low. It was a fact as simple and hard as the land itself. The salt was a fine white dust at the bottom of the barrel. The flour sack was limp. But the need that scraped at Jonah's nerves was the small cardboard box of .44 cartridges. He had 6 rounds in his belt. There were 3 left in the box. A man in the Arizona Territory with only 9 bullets was a man living on borrowed time. He needed more. Kerosene for the lamps, a new file for the saw, and, he admitted to himself, he needed soft cotton. The bolts of white cotton Ephraim Dodd kept on the high shelf, the kind reserved for church dresses and new babies. The linen bandages he had used on Sachi were clean, but they were coarse. He found himself wanting to provide something better, something soft. He told her at dawn, his voice flat to hide the reluctance. I have to ride to Payson Crossing. We are low on supplies. She was on the porch, combing her hair with the wooden comb he had given her. She stopped, her hand frozen. The town. She knew what the town meant. He pulled his hat low, tugging the brim down to shadow his face, a gesture of defense that felt useless. I will be back before the light fades, he said. She said nothing, but he felt her eyes on his back as he saddled Comet. It was the first time he had left her alone at the ranch, and the 20 miles to town suddenly felt like 1,000. Payson Crossing was not a town. It was an outpost, a collection of necessities held together by dust and mule-headedness. It smelled of stale beer, horse sweat, and wood smoke. As Jonah rode down the single street, the usual noise of the settlement seemed to dip, like a conversation pausing when a wolf is spotted at the edge of the firelight. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking. The blacksmith's hammer, usually a steady rhythm, fell silent. Jonah called her. The quiet beekeeper was no longer invisible. He was the man who kept the Apache girl. The rumor had run ahead of him, carried on the same dry wind he breathed. He tied Comet to the hitching post outside Dodd's general store. The bell above the door gave a weak, tinny jingle. Ephraim Dodd, a small man who survived by bending, was behind the counter polishing his spectacles. He flinched when he saw Jonah. Jonah! Cold one coming, Dodd muttered, not meeting his eye. Ephraim. Jonah walked past the pot-bellied stove. 3 men were sitting there, their chairs tipped back, boots propped up. He recognized them. They worked for Bale Harker, a rancher who ran his outfit with more ambition than morals. Harker himself, the oldest, had a face like a dried-out creek bed, all mean cracks and hard lines. Jonah began to gather his things, his movements stiff, He dropped a heavy bag of salt on the counter, a 50-pound sack of flour, a box of 44s, Ephraim, and a bolt of the white cotton from the top shelf. Dodd's eyes, small and quick, darted to Harker. The 44s, of course. Jonah. The cotton. You know, I think I might be fresh out. You are not, Jonah said, his voice quiet. He could see the end of the bolt from where he stood. The front legs of Bale Harker's chair hit the floor with a slam. Here you're in the domestic line now. Calder. Jonah did not turn. He kept his eyes on Dodd. The supplies. Ephraim. I'll be on my way. A man buys soft cotton for one of two things. Harker's voice grated, loud in the small space. A new baby or a woman. And I hear you got yourself a woman, just not the right color. The other two men chuckled. A low, ugly sound. Jonah's hand, resting on the counter, clenched into a fist. He could feel the splintered grain of the wood under his knuckles. He remembered his vow. Do not make trouble. Keep her safe. Trouble will find her if you bring it home. Heard they don't warm the same. Anyway, Harker pushed, standing up. He was a big man, built thick with spoiled meat and cheap whiskey. He hitched his pants. I mean, a red woman. They ain't got the same refinements as a white woman. Course, you'd know about that. Jonah turned slowly. His whole body coiled. This is not your business, Bale. Maybe it is. This is a white man's town. We don't much like mixing. Harker spat a stream of tobacco juice. It landed inches from Jonah's boot, a dark, deliberate stain on the floor. Then again, I suppose any woman is better than a dead one. Maybe you just like me cold, like that wife of yours. Heard May was coughing up her lungs long before she... The world compressed. The vow evaporated. The store, the men, the sacks of flour, they all vanished. There was only the name of his dead wife, spoken by this animal. Jonah didn't swing. A swing was sloppy. A swing was for a fight. This was an execution. He moved from the floor, his left hand grabbing the front of Harker's shirt, pulling him off balance. His right hand traveled no more than 6 inches. A short, brutal piston. It was the surgeon's knowledge of anatomy and the soldier's application of force. The sound was not a punch. It was a crack, a wet, solid, anatomical sound of cartilage and bone surrendering. Harker made a noise like a stepped-on frog and went down in a heap, his hands flying to his face as blood gushed between his fingers. He did not get back up. The other two men scrambled to their feet, their hands dropping to their holstered guns. Jonah did not look at them. He was still breathing, his own knuckles split and burning, staring at the man on the floor. That's enough. The voice cut through the ringing in his ears. Marta Leland stood in the doorway, her duster unbuttoned, her hand resting near her hip. She was a widow. She had buried a husband and 2 children, and she feared nothing left in this valley. She assessed the scene in one glance. The man on the floor, Jonah's bleeding hand, Dodd, who was trying to hide behind his own counter. Get him out of here, she said to Harker's 2 men. They hesitated. Now, or you're all sleeping in my jail, Bale included. They scrambled, grabbing their boss by the arms and dragging him out, leaving a thick trail of blood on the floorboards. Marta looked at Jonah. My office. He grabbed his supplies. Ephraim, the cotton. Dodd, pale and shaking, threw the bolt at him. Jonah paid for his goods, his hands trembling with a sudden, violent release of adrenaline, and followed her out. The street was silent. In her small, spare office, she did not offer him a seat. She stood by the window, looking out at the town that was now buzzing with his name. He mentioned May, Jonah said. The words sounded hollow. An excuse. I figured, Marta said, not turning. It's the only thing that would make a man as careful as you do something that stupid. You broke his nose. Jonah? Good. No, not good. She turned on him, her eyes hard. You just made yourself the center of this. Ransom Pike was in town last week. No, not him. His name was. He's been in Prescott, flashing papers. Jonah's blood went cold. Papers. Guardianship papers, Marta said, her voice low. Signed by Judge Whitlow. He's calling her his ward, an Apache ward, rescued from her heathen family, to be educated in his school. Jonah felt the floor drop. Whitlow was a railroad judge, a man whose signature could be bought with a bottle of whiskey and a railroad bond. It's a lie. She was chained. It doesn't matter if it's a lie if it has a stamp on it, Marta snapped. Pike has railroad backing. He has money. He has a piece of paper that says that girl is his property, and you just assaulted a man in public, a man who will now be Pike's best witness. You just told the whole town she's yours. You've drawn the line. Jonah, and Pike is just the man to cross it. The fear he had felt leaving the ranch was nothing. That was a vague shadow. This was a monster, solid and real, wearing a judge's robe. What do I do, Marta? You go home. You keep your head down, but that punch was loud. You can't unring that bell. He rode Comet harder than he ever had, not caring about the lather on the horse's neck, pushing him into a ground-eating lope. The wind was a solid wall against him, ripping at the brim of his hat, stinging his eyes until they watered. The desert wind didn't feel cleansing. It felt like it was scraping him raw. The fear was no longer a shadow. It had a name. It was Judge Whitlow. It was guardianship. It was a legal chain he could not cut with a hacksaw. He burst into the yard, Comet's flanks heaving, the horse stumbling in his haste. Sachi was on the porch. She was standing, her hand gripping the porch post, her knuckles white. She had been watching the road. She had known, from the way he rode, that he was not just bringing supplies. He was bringing the storm. He swung down, his body aching, not from the ride, but from the dread. He fumbled with the saddlebags, pulling out the supplies, dropping the bolt of cotton. Jonah! He turned. She was standing in front of him, having crossed the porch without a sound. Her eyes were not on the supplies. They were on his face. His lip was split, a small, clean cut at the corner of his mouth, probably from one of Harker's teeth. He hadn't even felt it. She said nothing. She went into her cedar room, then came back. She held the small tin of honey salve and a strip of clean linen. She motioned for him to sit on the porch step. He obeyed, feeling like a dish-rag child. He was a surgeon, a soldier. He felt utterly defeated. She knelt in the dirt in front of him. Her fingers were light, impersonal. She dipped a corner of the linen into the dark salve and pressed it gently to his lip. He winced, not from the sting, but from the proximity. It was a clinical, detached motion. But her hands were not steady. They were shaking. He looked at her, really looked, past the blur of his own fear. Her jaw was tight, her brow furrowed. She wasn't scared. She was angry. It was a cold, simmering rage that made her small hands tremble. She was angry for him. She finished, her work neat and precise. She drew her hands back, clasping them in her lap to still them. But they continued to shake. She looked down at the red dust between her feet. She spoke, and her voice was so quiet it was almost just a breath of the wind. A sound that would be lost forever if he wasn't sitting so close. "No one?" she whispered. She swallowed and tried again. "No one has bled for me before." Jonah stopped breathing. The punch in the store, the crack of Harker's nose. Marta's warning it was all just noise. That one, simple, whispered sentence landed with the force of a cannonball. It knocked the air from his lungs and the strength from his spine. It was a confession of a life so brutal he could not imagine it, and a bond he had never asked for, and an obligation he now knew he would die to protect. The fear was still there, but it now had a partner: resolve. The wind hit the cabin not as a push, but as a fist. It was the storm Sachi had predicted, but knowing it was coming did not blunt its edge. It arrived just after full dark, a howl that began in the high peaks of the Sierra Ancha and came down Tonto Creek like a freight train. Jonah was checking the latch on his door, a piece of wood he had whittled himself, when the first real crack of thunder split the sky. It was not a rumble. It was a cosmic plank of wood snapping. A sound so loud and close it shook the dust from the rafters. The door to Sachi's cedar room, the one he had built with 2 exits, burst open. She didn't scream. The sound she made was a sharp, indrawn gasp, a sound of pure, hoarding panic. Jonah turned, the lamp in his hand casting his shadow large against the wall. She was standing in the doorway, framed, her face a stark white mask in the gloom. Her eyes were wide and blind, not seeing him, not seeing the cabin. She was seeing the burned-out wagon, feeling the iron on her ankle, hearing the voices of the men who had left her to die. Another blast of thunder, simultaneous with a flash of lightning that lit the room in a cold, blue-white negative, sent her stumbling forward. She fell to her knees, her hands covering her head, her body curling into itself. She was waiting for the blow, or the fire. Jonah's first instinct, the doctor's, was to rush, to grab, to hold, to fix. His second instinct, the soldier's, was to give orders, to shout over the noise. He did neither. He remembered the skittish colt he had bought last year, the one that would break its own leg in a panic if cornered. You didn't run at it. You made yourself a safe, unmoving object. He crossed the room in 2 strides and sat on the floor. Not in front of her, but a few feet away, near the hearth. He put his back to her, a deliberate, non-threatening posture. He was not a threat approaching. He was a wall, a shield. He was the barrier between her and the door, between her and the howling blackness. The storm raged. Rain began to hiss against the windows, driven by a wind that sounded like a living thing trying to tear the shingles from the roof. Sachi was rocking, a low, terrified keen coming from her throat. Jonah did not speak. Empty words. It's all right. You're safe, were lies in the face of a memory this strong. The memory was the truth for her, and the storm was its voice. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He breathed. He closed his eyes and forced his own heart to slow. He, too, felt the adrenaline of the storm, the old battlefield tension. He fought it. He breathed in, slow, counting to 5. He held it. He breathed out, slower, counting to 8. He made his breathing audible, a low, steady rhythm beneath the chaos of the wind, a human sound in the cacophony. In, 2, 3, 4, 5, out, 2, 3. He did this for a full minute, his back a solid, warm presence. The keening sound from her began to quiet, replaced by hitched, ragged breaths. She was listening, slowly, like a hand emerging from ice. He felt a touch. Her fingers, small and trembling, landed on the back of his shoulder. They gripped the thick wool of his shirt, a desperate, anchoring touch. He did not turn. He just continued to breathe. Her hand unclutched, flattened. It slid from his shoulder, across his back, moving to the center of his body. He felt her shift, her knee scuffing the floor. She was moving closer. Her hand found his chest. She pressed her palm flat against his heart. He stopped breathing for a second, startled by the intimacy of the touch, the sheer, naked vulnerability of the gesture. He could feel the cold from her skin, even through his shirt, under her palm. His heart, which he had willed to be slow, gave a heavy, traitorous thump. Her voice was a whisper, a wisp of sound in the eye of the storm. Your heart. He waited. Is there room? She asked. For me? Jonah's throat closed. It was the simplest and most complex question he had ever been asked. It was not a question about the cabin or the land. It was a question about the small, scarred, locked-up space in his own chest, the one he had sealed shut when he shoveled the last dirt onto May's grave. Is there a room? He did not answer with a word. A word was too easy. A word could be a lie. Slowly, he turned, not to face her, but to sit beside her. He was still the wall, but he was a wall she could lean on. And he reached, his hand covering hers. Her skin was like cold creek water. His was warm from the fire. He laced his fingers through hers, a gesture that was both a capture and a surrender. He did not say, yes. He kept her hand in his, and he drew it away from his heart. He moved it to his side, to the solid cage of his ribs. He pressed her palm flat against the space just below his arm, where the muscle was thin and the lung and heart were close. He held her hand there. "Breathe with me," he whispered. He took his own. Slow breath. In. 2, 3, 4, 5. He held it. He felt her palm, pressed against him. Feel the expansion of his ribs, the swell of air, the life. Out. 2, 3, 4. He felt the tension in her fingers begin to dissolve. He felt the first warmth return to her skin as his own heat transferred. He did not pull away. He just held her hand against him, the two of them breathing as one. The storm raged. The wind shrieked. It did not matter. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the shared, steady rhythm of their breathing. The distance between them, the few inches of air, became charged. He looked at her. Her eyes were no longer blind. They were dark, deep, and fixed on his. They were full of questions, but the terror was gone, banked by a new, hesitant warmth. The firelight caught the healing line of the scar on her forehead, the dampness on her lashes. His own gaze was just as honest. He was not a man of grand passions, but of quiet depths. His eyes did not promise forever. They promised now. They promised solid. He leaned, not just with his head, but with his whole body. It was a movement so slow it was almost imperceptible. He was giving her time, a full second, 2, a lifetime to pull away. He was asking permission with his body, his gaze. She did not pull away. She did not move at all, except for her eyes, which closed. It was the yes. When his lips met hers, it was not a clash, it was a landing. It was the finding of a place that had been missing. It was not the heat of passion. It was the heat of profound, unbelievable, life-giving warmth. It was two solitary, broken things touching and finding they were no longer sharp. It was the taste of salt and wood smoke and the faint, sweet trace of honey. It was a promise, kept before it was made. He brought his other hand up, not to her head, not to pull her closer, but to cup her jaw, his thumb resting on the pulse that beat there, a frantic, bird-wing rhythm. He just held her, anchoring her, as the kiss, her first, his first in an age, said everything they had no words for. He felt a single tear escape her closed lashes and trace a path over his thumb. It was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release, a chain breaking, a wall crumbling, and in the warm, orange light of the hearth, as the storm outside spent its fury, they held that kiss, a quiet, simple embrace that was the beginning and end of a world. Later, the storm had quieted to a steady, drumming rain. The wind had lost its voice. They lay on his bedroll, the one he had dragged in front of the fire, fully dressed, the wool blanket pulled over them both. She was tucked against his side, her head resting not on his chest, but in the curve of his neck, her cheek against his throat. Her breathing was deep and even. She was asleep. No, her eyes were open. She was listening to the rain. She shifted, pressing her cold nose against his skin. "This," she whispered, her voice muffled. "This is what warm means." Jonah, who had been staring into the embers, his heart a thing he could barely recognize, closed his eyes, his arm, wrapped around her, tightened, drawing her impossibly closer. He felt the place inside him that had been cold and empty for so long, a hollow ache, begin to fill. It was a painful, beautiful, terrifying feeling. He kissed the top of her hair, breathing in the scent of her, sage and rain and smoke. "Warm is having you," he answered, his voice rough. "And it is us, choosing, together." He felt her small nod against his skin. They said nothing else. They lay and listened to the rain, the sound no longer a threat, but a promise, washing the world clean. The morning was born in a hush. The world outside was scoured, sharp and shining. The air was cold and clean. Jonah woke first, stiff, one arm completely numb from where she'd been lying on it. He lay still, afraid to move, to break the spell. Sachi was still asleep, her face relaxed. Younger, the lines of fear and suspicion erased. He watched, for the first time, not as a doctor or a protector, but as a man. She woke as he did, not with a slow stretch, but with a sudden, silent opening of her eyes. She was instantly aware. She met his gaze. A new feeling entered the room, an adorable, profound awkwardness. A shyness bloomed. She, who had faced death, who had put her hand on his heart, suddenly did not know what to do with her eyes. She looked away, a faint flush creeping up her neck. He, who had cut men open and stitched them shut, suddenly felt as clumsy as a boy. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her, and scrambled off the bedroll. Moving to the other side of the cabin, her back to him, her hair a wild, dark curtain. He sat up, too, running a hand through his own rumpled hair. He said, clearing his throat. I'll make coffee. He busied himself with the fire, the grinder, the pot, his hands fumbling. It was a simple morning ritual, but today it felt brand new. He heard a movement. She had gone into her cedar room. He poured water, his heart thudding, a strange mix of hope and fear. Had he presumed too much? Had the night been just a product of the storm? She emerged 5 minutes later. He had the coffee pot nested in the coals. He turned, and his own heart stopped. She was dressed. She had washed her face, and she had done her hair. It was no longer loose, or in the simple, single braid she sometimes wore. She had parted it, pulled it back, and tied it in a specific, intricate knot at the nape of her neck. He had seen it once before, on an Apache woman in Prescott, one who was being married at the courthouse. It was not a style for a girl. It was the style of a woman spoken for, a woman who had made a promise. She met his gaze, the shyness gone, replaced by a clear, steady, sovereign light. She had not just chosen him in the dark. She was claiming him in the light. It was a declaration, silent, brilliant, and as powerful as the sun rising over the Mogollon Rim. The new, delicate peace of the ranch lasted less than 2 days. The air was still clean from the storm, the ground dark and damp, holding the promise of new life. Jonah was in the bee house, repairing a stack of frames, and Sachi was outside, mending a tear in his canvas work coat, her stitches small and strong. The domesticity of the scene was so new, so fragile, it was almost painful. Then, the dogs. Not his. He heard them first, a yelping, undisciplined sound from down the creek. Then, the horses. Sachi was on her feet in an instant. The coat dropped in the dust. Her face was pale, her hand instinctively flying to her throat. She looked at Jonah as he emerged from the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. "Go inside," he said, his voice low. "No," she said. She stood her ground, just behind his shoulder. 4 riders broke from the cottonwoods. They did not approach at a polite walk. They fanned out, as if they were surrounding a stubborn steer. The man in front was Ransom Pike. Jonah had only seen him once, in town, but he recognized the self-righteous set of the man's shoulders. He was dressed in a black town coat, his face thin and pale, his eyes holding a zealot's fire. Beside him, nursing a bandaged, swollen nose, was Bale Harker. His eyes, small and dark, were fixed on Jonah with a look of pure, curdled hatred. The other 2 were gunmen, hired by the look of them. They wore their holsters low, and their faces were empty, which made them the most dangerous men there. They reined in, 20 yards from the porch. "Jonah Calder," Pike called out, his voice thin as a reed, but carrying, "I am here on God's business, and the business of the territory." "You're on my land, Pike," Jonah said, his voice flat. He did not move, his hands at his sides, open. Sachi was a shadow of pure tension behind him. "This is not your land to claim in sin." Pike's voice rose, cracking. "I am here for my ward, the heathen girl you have taken." He unrolled a piece of paper from his coat, a document with a blue ribbon. "I have papers, a writ of guardianship, signed by the Honorable Judge Whitlow of Prescott. She is my charge, my property." He kicked his horse forward. holding out the paper. Harker and the gunman moved with him, their hands resting on their thighs, near their guns. "You will give her over," Pike demanded. "That's far enough," Jonah said. His voice had not risen, but it had gained a new weight, a new edge of iron. The gunman stopped. Pike's horse, sensing the tension, took a nervous step back. "The law is on my side. Calder, you will unhand her, or I will have you arrested for theft and carnal." "You're not arresting anyone, Pike." The new voice, dry and weary, came from the trail. Marta Leland rode into the yard, alone, on her big bay. She looked as she always did, tired. She rode not to Jonah and not to Pike, but between them, placing her horse broadside. She sighed, a long, deep breath that seemed to carry all the dust of the valley. "Marta, thank God," Pike said, his tone shifting to one of oily relief. "This man is harboring stolen? I read the written town." "Pike!" Marta cut him off, her voice sharp. She didn't look at him. She looked at Jonah. "It's real," she said to him. A statement, not an accusation. "The seal is blurry, and Whitlow's signature is a drunken scrawl. But it's legal. It's enough to file a civil case. It's enough to say she's his." Jonah's blood went cold. He could break Harker's nose. He could not fight a piece of paper. "Now, I don't want blood," Marta said, raising her voice to include them all. "Pike, that paper says you have guardianship. It does not say you can take her with guns. Jonah, that paper says she has a claim on her. This is a court matter now, not a creekside brawl." She turned in her saddle to face Pike. "But a civil claim is a thing a person can dispute. A ward can speak." She looked past Jonah, her gaze landing on Sachi, who had stood frozen, a ghost in the bright sunlight. "If she states, in a court, in front of a judge, that she is here of her own free will, it complicates your paper." All eyes, which had been on the men, now turned to the woman. She was the prize, the object, the ward. She was the center of the storm. Pike sneered. "She can't speak. She's a savage. She has no rights to." "She has a voice," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. Sachi stepped forward. She moved from behind Jonah, a deliberate, conscious act. She was no longer a shadow. She was a woman, in the open. She looked at the paper in Pike's hand, the one he held like a weapon. "Let me see," she said. Her voice was quiet, but clear. Pike looked shocked. He clearly hadn't expected her to speak. He held the paper out, but kept it clutched in his fist. Sachi walked toward him. Jonah tensed, his hand balling into a fist, ready to pull her back, but he did not. This was her ground to claim. She walked until she was just 3 feet from Pike's horse. She did not look at him. She looked at the paper. Her eyes scanned the script. She had only been learning for weeks, but she had been a quick, desperate student. She saw the words, the ones he had taught her at the kitchen table, and she saw the new ones. She saw property. She saw custody. She saw ward. The color drained from her face, leaving her a pale, ashen gray. The fear from the night of the storm, the memory of the chain, it all came rushing back. She saw the iron link in the scrawled ink. Then, just as quickly, the paleness was replaced by a dark, rising flush, a cold, quiet, profound rage. She did not look at Pike. She turned her back on him, a gesture of dismissal so complete it was like a slap. She faced Marta Leland. "I am not property," she said, her voice shaking, "but not from fear, from anger. I am not his ward. I am free." She then turned, not to Jonah, but to face the yard, the cabin, the bee houses. "I choose this house." And then she looked at Jonah. She looked him in the eye, her gaze locking with his, a look of such fierce, possessive, and terrifying certainty that it stopped his heart. "I am his wife," she said. The world stopped. Harker's snicker died in his throat. The gunman, for the first time, looked uncomfortable. Marta Leland's jaw dropped. And Jonah, who had been ready to fight, who had been ready to die, was stunned into silence. She had not asked. She had not consulted. She had, in the face of the law and the gun, made her final move. She had claimed him. She had claimed this life. Pike's face went purple. Wife, that's a lie. A heresy, a sin. You are not married. Jonah found his voice. He looked at Sachi, at the woman who had bound her hair and now had bound her life to his. He stepped forward, to stand beside her. He looked at Pike, and then at Marta. He nodded. Once. A slow, heavy gesture. It was not a lie. It was a vow. She is my wife, he said. Pike began to scream then. A string of spit-flecked words. Blasphemy unsanctified. I'll have a railroad jury. I'll have you both burned. Harker, regaining his composure, spat a thick stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He's bedding her. That's all. It ain't a marriage. Enough. Marta's voice was a whip. She had recovered. She was the law. It's been claimed. That makes it a court matter, a serious one. Pike, your paper is now in dispute by a claim of marriage. That's a different court, a different judge. She took a breath, playing for time. Here's what happens. This yard is now a disputed line. I am setting a date. 3 days. That's how long. We will have a preliminary hearing in my office. A circuit judge is due in Payson. He will hear the claims. Pike, you will present your paper. Jonah, you will present your wife. She looked at Pike, her eyes cold. Until then, you stay off this land. You and your men. You cross this creek. You are not a plaintiff. You are a trespasser. And I will arrest you. She looked at Jonah. And you. You'll be at my office in 3 days. Both of you. And you stay there. No more broken noses. No more guns. You let the law handle this. Pike was trembling with rage, but he saw the look in Marta's eyes. And he saw the 2 gunmen, who were now looking at Marta, not at him. They were paid for a job, not to fight the law. This is not over, Calder. Pike spat. God will not be mocked. Just be there in 3 days, Pike, Marta said, slumping in her saddle. Get out of here. Pike wrenched his horse's head around. Harker gave Jonah one last look of pure poison. They rode, the 4 of them, back across the creek, their menace lingering in the air like dust. Marta waited until they were gone. She looked at Jonah, at Sachi. She looked at the cabin, at the beehives. Jonah, she said, her voice soft now, and full of a terrible pity. You know that paper is just the first. Even if you win this, they will come. The railroad wants this valley. Pike is just their dog. Be careful. She turned her horse and rode away, leaving them alone in the quiet, violated yard. Jonah turned to Sachi. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a cold, hard dread. She's right, he said, his voice urgent. They will not wait 3 days. Harker's not a man for courts. He grabbed her arm, his touch rougher than he intended. We have to go. Up to the Mogollon Rim. There are caves. They will never find us there. He was already packing in his mind. Food, blankets, ammunition. He was thinking of the cold, of the long winter. But they would be safe. Sachi pulled her arm from his grasp. She did not look at him. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the bee house. She walked away from him, to the nearest hive. It was the one they had smoked together. The sun was warm on the white wood. She placed her palm flat against it. She could feel the deep, steady vibration of the colony inside. Thousands of lives working, building, defending their home. A low, powerful hum. No, she said. Jonah stopped, the list of supplies dying in his throat. Sachi, this is not a fight we can win. That is the law. That is the railroad. I am not the girl under the wagon, she said, her voice low, vibrating with the same energy as the hive. She turned to face him, her eyes as clear and hard as the morning sky. This is our place. She had not said your, she had said our. The word, the one she had used in front of Pike, settled on him, a weight heavier and more permanent than a legal paper. He looked at her hand on the hive. He looked at his home. He had come here to escape, to be alone. He was not alone anymore. The fear did not leave. It sharpened. The surgeon, the soldier, the man who had held his dying wife, all of him focused. He was no longer planning to run. He was planning to stay. He walked to the woodpile. He picked up his shovel. He did not look at Sachi. "All right," he said. "Get the water canteens. Fill them. Fill every pot we have. Bring them in the cabin. And bar the windows. Not for them. For the smoke." He walked, not to the creek, but to the low ridge behind the cabin. He began to dig. He was not digging a grave. He was digging a firebreak. He was clearing a field of fire. He was a beekeeper, a doctor, a man who held small, dead things in his hand. And he would defend his hive. He would not start the fight. He would not plan to murder. But he would. He knew with a terrible, cold certainty. Be ready to finish it. The first day of Marta's 3-day truce was the loudest. The silence was a physical weight, a ringing in the ears. Every snap of a twig, every call of a hawk, was a threat. Jonah worked, his hands needing the rhythm of familiar tasks, but his mind was on the ridge. He moved the bulk of his ammunition, the new boxes of .44s, from the store box to a sealed tin under the floorboards of the bee house. He buried his spare rifle, wrapped in oilcloth, near the creek. He was a man preparing for a siege, not a court date. The second day. The silence curdled. It was too quiet. The air was heavy. Still, the world holding its breath. Jonah trusted Marta's authority. Sachi, who had lived her life by the laws of the earth, not of men, trusted nothing. She spent the day on the low ridge behind the cabin, the one Jonah had cleared. She sat with her knees drawn up, May's old brass spyglass to her eye. It was small, heavy, and its lens was clear. She did not watch the main trail from town. She watched the dry wash to the south, the broken, dead land, late in the afternoon. As the sun began to dip, painting the rocks a deep, bloody orange, she saw it. It was not a cloud. Wind dust was soft. It drifted. This was hard. Vertical. It was the purposeful dust of shod horses. Moving fast. She put the glass on it. 1, 2, 3, 4 riders. They were in the wash, using the low ground for cover, and they were not riding toward town. They were riding for the cabin. They were not waiting for the third day. She slid down the ridge, her feet sure, not making a sound. She ran to the bee house, where Jonah was oiling the action of his Winchester. "They come," she said, "not are coming." It was a statement of fact. 4, from the south. Jonah's blood ran cold. He grabbed the rifle. "Get in the cabin. Sachi, bar the door. Stay low." "No." She looked at him, her eyes clear, her face set. "They burn this house. They burn this." She pointed to the bee house. "They take me. I won't let them." "You will not fight for." She looked at the Winchester in his hand, then at the Colt on his hip. "Where?" "Ammo," she asked, using the word he had taught her. He nodded to the floorboards. "In the tin, but—" She understood instantly. The house was the anchor. The bee house was the armory. If they were pinned down, they would be burned out. She had to unanchor them. She had to change the ground. She snatched the rifle from his hand. "Sachi, no!" Before he could grab it, she raised it to the sky, pointed it away from the creek, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle was a violation, splitting the quiet. It was an alarm. It told their attackers they had been seen. It told them the element of surprise was lost. And it was a signal, a desperate, smoking message to Marta Leland, miles away, that the truce was broken. "What did you do?" Jonah yelled, grabbing for the rifle. She pushed it back at him. "They want me," she said, her voice fierce. "Not the house, not the bees." And then she did the last thing he expected. She turned and ran, not toward the cabin, not toward the creek. She ran east, away from the bee house, away from the supplies, making herself a clear, open target, scrambling up the rocks toward the high bluffs overlooking the canyon. She was a decoy. She was drawing the fight, drawing the fire, away from their home. "Damn it," Jonah roared. He couldn't go after her, not directly. To follow her was to fall into the same trap. He grabbed his Colt, checked its load, and sprinted. Not after her, but around her, disappearing into the thick willow and cottonwood brush along the creek bed. He was using the terrain, moving to intersect, to get above them. The rifle shot spurred the riders. They broke from the cover of the wash, their horses churning up the dust. Jonah could hear Pike's high-pitched, reedy voice, shouting orders, but one voice, thick and guttural from a broken nose, roared above it. There she is, the witch is mine. Bale Harker, his face a mask of purple and yellow bruises, split from the group. He spurred his horse, a big, heavy roan, driving it straight at Sachi. The other two gunmen fanned out, following him, their rifles already drawn. Pike, as Jonah expected, hung back, a coward at the center of the violence. Sachi was fast, her feet finding holds a town man would never see, but she was on foot, and Harker was on a horse. He cut her off, his horse rearing, blocking her path up the rocks. He didn't wait for his men. He was insane with rage and humiliation. He launched himself from the saddle. He hit her like a falling tree. His weight drove her back, driving the air from her lungs in a sharp gasp. They tumbled in the sharp rocks and dry, thorny brush. He was heavy, his breath hot and smelling of stale whiskey. "You'll pay for my face, you red whore," he snarled, his hand tangling in her hair, yanking her head back. He raised his other hand, a beefy fist, to strike her. Sachi had no weapon, not a gun, not a bow, but in the pocket of her dress, she had the small, curved knife from the cabin, the one Jonah had seen her use to peel apples, to cut thread. Its blade was no more than 3 inches long, worn smooth. As Harker's fist descended, her hand was a blur. She drew the small knife. She did not stab. She did not have the strength to drive it through his thick coat. She slashed. It was a precise, cold movement, learned from gutting a fish, from scraping a hide. The small blade met the flesh of his face. It was a streak of angry lightning. She cut him, a deep, clean line from the corner of his eye, down across the new, swollen bridge of his nose, to his lip. Harker screamed. It was not a roar. It was a high, thin, bubbling shriek of pure, agonizing pain. He recoiled, letting go of her, his hands flying to his ruined face. My eyes, she cut me." Blood gushed, a black river in the twilight. Sachi scrambled to her feet, the small, bloody knife clutched in her hand. She was breathing in great, ragged gulps. The other two gunmen arrived, reining their horses back so hard they nearly fell. They saw Harker on the ground, writhing, his blood painting the rocks. They saw Sachi, standing like a cornered wolf, the knife in her hand. "Get her!" one of them shouted, swinging down from his horse, his pistol drawn. "Grab her!" The others stayed mounted, leveling his rifle. They herded her, using their bodies, their guns. Sachi stumbled backward. The ground behind her was empty. She was at the edge. The bluff ended. Below her, a sheer drop of 200 feet. The bottom of the canyon was a jagged, cruel puzzle of shattered rock and dry creek bed. There was nowhere else to run. "End of the line, girl," the man on foot said, walking toward her, his pistol steady. "Drop the knife." They didn't hear him. They were focused on her, on the cliff. They never saw the shadow detach itself from the deep darkness of a juniper tree 50 yards away, on the other side of a small ravine. Jonah had used the creek to come around. He was above them. He was resting his Winchester on a flat, solid slab of granite. His heart was a drum against his ribs. He could hear the blood in his ears. He was a doctor, a beekeeper. He had not taken a life since Shiloh. He thought of her, her hand on his heart. Is there a room, he breathed, in, slow, held, out, slower. The world narrowed to the V of his front sight. The man on foot. He was the immediate threat. He was raising his pistol to aim. Jonah's breath left his body. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was flat, final. The man on foot didn't cry out. He didn't stumble. He simply folded, as if his strings had been cut, his own pistol firing harmlessly into the dirt. He fell and did not move. The man on the horse spun. his eyes wide, confused, trying to find the source of the shot. He raised his rifle, aiming at Sachi, the only target he could see. Jonah had already worked the lever, the brass cartridge spinning out, the new one sliding home. He was steady. The surgeon's hand. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. He squeezed the trigger. The second crack echoed the first. The bullet took the man high in the chest, knocking him clean out of the saddle. He fell, a heavy, limp weight. His horse, screaming, bolted back down the trail. Silence. The echo died. The smell of gunpowder, sharp and sulfuric, filled the air. "Don't shoot, I surrender, I am unarmed." The wail was high and terrified. Jonah stepped out from the juniper's shadow, his rifle held low, but ready. Below them, by the horses, Ransom Pike was cowering, his face the color of ash. He was fumbling inside his black coat, his hands shaking so violently he could barely move. He pulled out a small, nickel-plated revolver. I have the law," he whimpered, trying to aim it. "Drop it, Pike." The voice was not Jonah's. It was Marta Leland's. She rode up the trail, her own gun drawn, flanked by 2 deputies. The single warning shot, followed by the 2 sharp, distinct cracks of a rifle, had been a map she could read all the way from town. Jonah walked forward, his rifle still ready. He walked to Sachi. She was standing at the edge of the world. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her hair was a wild, black tangle. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears he wasn't sure she knew she had shed. But she was standing straight. The bloody, apple-peeling knife was still in her hand. "Marta," Jonah said, his voice thick. "They broke the truce. They came for her." Marta dismounted, her eyes taking in the scene with a grim, practiced efficiency. The 2 dead gunmen, Pike, who had dropped his gun as if it were on fire, and Harker. He was crawling, dragging himself into a patch of prickly pear cactus, sobbing, holding his ruined, bleeding face. "He tried to take me," Sachi said. Her voice was not a whisper. It rang, clear and cold. In the twilight, "He tried to take me back. The writ." Pike babbled. "The law. My ward. He lies." Sachi said. She walked away from the cliff, toward Marta. She pointed at Pike, her hand steady. "He did not rescue me. He bought me. From men who killed my family. He paid them in silver." She walked past Pike, to Marta. "He put this on me." She bent and pulled up the hem of her worn dress, revealing the angry, puckered scar on her ankle. The one the iron shackle had left. "He and his men chained me. They left me in that wagon to die. They left me for the vultures." Marta looked at the scar. She looked at Pike. She looked at Harker, sobbing in the cactus. She had seen enough. She holstered her weapon and pulled the iron handcuffs from her belt. "Ransom Pike," she said, her voice like stone. "You are under arrest for inciting violence, for kidnapping, for human trafficking, and for 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder." "You can't," Pike shrieked, scrambling back. "I have a writ. I have friends. The railroad—" "Tell it to the circuit judge," Marta said, snapping one cuff on Pike's wrist. One of her deputies hauled him up, snapping the other cuff. "He's going to be very interested in your version of the law." The other deputy went to Harker, who was just a pathetic, bleeding mass of dishonor. "Get up, Harker. You're next." Jonah watched them go, his rifle heavy in his hands. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, hollow ache. He had killed 2 men. He, the healer. He turned to Sachi. He didn't know what to say. He looked at the blood on her small knife, at her torn dress, at the fierce, unbroken line of her jaw. She looked at him, at his steady presence, at the rifle he had used to save her. She let the small knife fall from her fingers. It clattered on the rock, a tiny sound in the grate, vast quiet. And then, her hand still trembling, she reached out and took his. Marta and her deputies were gone, taking the living and the dead. They left behind a silence that was heavier than the violence had been. The yard was scarred, the dust tracked with the heavy tread of boots and the desperate scramble of Harker's escape. Jonah and Sachi walked back from the bluff, not touching, but connected by the invisible thread of what had just passed. He had killed for her. She had been willing to die for him. The words they had spoken in front of Pike husband, wife, had been a defense. Now, in the twilight, they had become a fact, sealed in gunpowder and blood. The cabin was not untouched. Harker, in his initial, brutal charge, had kicked the door off its leather hinges. It lay splintered on the floor, and inside, a small, 6-inch mirror May had kept on the wall. A simple piece of silvered glass lay shattered in the corner, a victim of the concussion from the rifle shots. The night was spent in repair, work. It was the only thing they knew. Jonah rehung the door, his hands sure as he drilled new holes, his knuckles white as he tightened the new hinges. He was shutting the world out again. Sachi took the broom. She swept the floor, her movements short, angry, clearing the dirt and the tiny splinters of wood. But when she got to the corner, she stopped. She stared at the fragments of the mirror. She knelt, her hand hovering over the bright, broken pieces. She saw her own eye, wild and dark, reflected in a shard. She saw the torn shoulder of her dress. She saw the face of the girl at the edge of the cliff. She began to tremble. The adrenaline had worn off, and the cold, awful memory of Harker's weight, his hot, whiskey breath, washed over her. She saw the iron shackle. She saw the burned wagon. Jonah stopped his work. He saw her, kneeling, frozen by the memory. He did not go to her. He did not touch her. He walked to his peg, took down his heavy wool barn coat, the one that smelled of him, of sawdust and sage. He walked over and gently, without a word, draped it over her shoulders. He was not trapping her. He was not holding her. He was giving her a shield, a darkness to hide in. He was giving her the warmth of his own body, without the threat of his touch. She clutched the coat, burying her face in the rough wool, breathing him in. She stayed there for a long time, her shoulders shaking in a silent quake. When she finally rose, she wrapped the coat's arms around her waist, a suit of armor. She stepped over the broken glass, as if stepping over a memory, and continued to sweep. They finished in silence. The house was clean, the door was strong, they were safe, but the world had changed. The new world began the next morning. Jonah rose, his body aching, the phantom recoil of the rifle still in his shoulder. He built the fire, his movements automatic. He was a man with a routine. He put the iron skillet on the hearth to heat. He took out the slab of bacon he had bought in town. He sliced 3 thick strips. They hit the hot iron with a loud, comforting sizzle. The smell of salt, smoke, and rendering fat filled the small cabin. A smell of domesticity, of normalcy. From the cedar room, now a part of the cabin, came a sudden, choked sound. Sachi stumbled out, her hand clamped over her mouth. Her face, in the morning light, was a pale, greenish white. She ran past him, out the newly mended door, and he heard her retching in the yard. Jonah froze. His hand, holding the knife, stopped mid-air. He stared at the sizzling bacon. He was a doctor. He had seen this 100 times. Sickness in the morning, brought on by a strong smell. He looked at the door. He looked at the skillet. He looked at the calendar he kept, a simple set of marks on the wall. He thought of the storm. He counted the weeks. 6, maybe 7. His hand began to shake. He dropped the knife. It clattered on the stone hearth, a sound as loud as the rifle shot had been. She came back in, wiping her mouth, her face pale but her eyes clear. She looked ashamed. "The smell," she whispered. "It is too strong." He stared at her, not at her face, but at her waist, at her belly, hidden under the loose dress. He was a man who had seen death, who had lost a wife, who had buried his past. He did not know how to hope. "Sachi," he said, his voice a dry rasp. She knew what he was asking. She had known for weeks. She, who knew her body like she knew the sky, had been waiting. She had been tracking her own cycle, the way her people did, with the moon. She walked to the post on the porch. the one that framed the door to her old room. He had never noticed the marks. They were tiny, a row of small, sharp cuts in the wood, almost invisible. She pointed to them. Then she pointed to a space, a long, unmarked space. 2 moons, she whispered. No, sign. She looked at him, and her face, so often a mask of survival and fierce defense, softened. A slow, hesitant, powerful smile spread from her mouth to her eyes. It was a smile of profound, terrifying, secret knowledge. Jonah looked at the marks. He looked at her smile. He stumbled back and sat hard on the stool. He put his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. He was a man who had not cried at his wife's funeral. He had not cried when he'd shot the men on the bluff. But now, a sound tore from his chest, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was the sound of a man breaking open, a vault door groaning on rusted hinges. He laughed, a wild, sharp, unbelievable sound. He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "We," he said, his voice breaking, "we have a seed." She nodded, the smile never leaving her face. She came and, for the first time, knelt in front of him, not as a patient, not as a victim, but as his wife. She put her small, strong hands on his knees. The work changed. That afternoon, he did not go to the hives. He did not go to his leather bench. He took his axe, his saw, and his crowbar. He went to the wall of the cedar room, the wall he had built to keep her separate, the wall that had defined her as other. He tore it down. The sound of splintering wood, the crash of the planed boards, was a celebration. He was not just expanding a room, he was erasing a boundary. He worked with a feverish energy, sweat soaking his shirt. He was making room. He rebuilt the wall, but further out, enclosing the entire side porch, he used fresh-cut juniper, the wood smelling sharp and clean, its purple-red heartwood a promise of strength. He tore out the small, high window he had built for her safety. In its place, he framed a new, large window, a window that faced east. "For the morning sun," he told her, as he set the frame. "For a child. A child needs the morning sun." The nights were for the new, quiet work. The cabin was warm. The fire lit against the deepening cold of winter. After their meal, Sachi would sit on the hearth, her hands busy. She had taken the soft bolt of white cotton he had bought in town. She had made thread from deer sinew, fine and strong. She was sewing. She was making small, impossibly small shirts. Her stitches even, precise and steady as a heartbeat. Jonah worked with his own tools. He had gone to the creek and found a log of aspen, pale and smooth. He brought it inside, and with his sharpest draw knife, he began to carve. He was not a man of easy words. His hands spoke for him. He was carving a cradle. He worked for weeks, the pile of white, fragrant shavings growing at his feet. He shaped the rockers. He smoothed the sides. He sanded it, again and again, with fine sand from the creek, and then with a piece of worn leather. He worked until the wood was no longer wood, but something like silk, something that would never catch on a baby's skin. He carved, and as he carved, he thought about the world he was bringing a child into, a world of pikes and harkers, of drought and violence, but also a world of honey and rain, and a woman who could read the sky. He finished the cradle and set it by the fire. It was perfect, but it was empty. He took the leftover scraps of aspen. He sat, and with his small whittling knife, the one Sachi had used on the bluff, he began to carve 3 small toys, 3 things to put on the sill of the new, east-facing window. First, he carved a deer, small, delicate, its head turned, listening. For dreams, he thought, for grace, for the ability to walk through a dangerous world without making a sound. Second, he carved a bee, a fat, round, worker bee, for the hive. He thought, for home, for the knowledge that you are part of something bigger, something that works together, something worth defending. Third, he carved a horse, not a saddle horse, not a work horse, a wild one, its mane flying, its legs bent in a full run, for freedom, for the spirit that could not be chained, not by iron and not by fear. A deer, a bee, a horse. He set the 3 small, white figures on the window ledge, where the morning sun would find them. Sachi watched him. She finished her sewing. The cradle was now lined with soft cotton, and a small stack of shirts lay waiting. That night, as the fire burned low, she began to humming. It was the lullaby, the Chiricahua sleep song. "Sing," she whispered, her hand resting on the smooth, empty curve of the cradle. "I can't," he said. "You know I'm terrible." "Sing," she insisted. "He or she, they must know your voice, as I do." She sang the first line, her voice low and sweet. He took a breath. He sang it back. His voice was a flat, off-key rumble. It was, as he had said, like a rusty hinge. It was objectively awful. She did not laugh, not this time. She smiled, a soft, warm smile in the firelight. She put her hand on his, the one that had carved the cradle. She sang the next line. He sang it with her. He was wrong by half a note, but his heart was in perfect key, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It filled the small, expanded room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The ride to Payson Crossing was not a retreat. It was an advance. Jonah rode Comet, his Winchester in the scabbard, his Colt on his hip. Beside him, Sachi rode the mule, sitting tall. She wore the clean wool shawl, and the cold morning air had brought a high color to her cheeks. She was several months pregnant now, her shape rounded and undeniable under the drape of the wool. This, Jonah knew, was their best defense, better than his rifle. Marta's office was not a courtroom. It was a 10-by-12 box of pine boards, and it was suffocating. The entire town, it seemed, had crammed itself inside. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, their wool coats smelling of sweat, damp, and tobacco. They were ranchers, prospectors, and the idle hands from the saloon. They were not here for justice. They were here for the spectacle. Jonah and Sachi sat on a bench near the front. Marta stood by her desk. At the desk sat a new man, a circuit judge named Elias Thorne. He was not like Whitlow. He was thin, wore clean spectacles, and his eyes were sharp and impatient. Ransom Pike sat on the other side, looking pale and pinched. Beside him was a slick-looking lawyer from Prescott, a man in a pinstriped suit that looked comically out of place. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice smooth, "we are here to reclaim a ward of the state, a minor, an untamed Apache girl, placed in the legal and spiritual guardianship of my client, Mr. Pike, by order of the esteemed Judge Whitlow. This man," he gusted to Jonah, "a known recluse, violently abducted this ward and has been holding her in a state of cohabitation." The crowd murmured. The word cohabitation hung in the air, thick and ugly. "Mr. Pike," the lawyer continued, "is a man of God, seeking only to bring this savage soul to the light. We have the writ." He produced the paper, the one with the smeared seal. Judge Thorne looked at it, his face betraying no emotion. He read it, then set it on the desk. "A writ of guardianship. I see it." He looked at Pike. "And where is Judge Whitlow?" "He is indisposed, Your Honor," the lawyer said quickly. "He is under investigation by the territorial marshal for trading writs for railroad bonds," Thorne said, his voice dry. "I'm aware. Marshal Leland. What are the territory's charges?" Marta stepped forward. She was not a lawyer. She was a witness. She placed a heavy dark object on the judge's desk. It landed with a loud, metallic clank that silenced the room. It was the iron shackle, the one Jonah had cut from Sachi's ankle. "That, Your Honor," Marta said, her voice clear, "is the guardianship Mr. Pike employed. I am charging him with kidnapping, trafficking in persons, and inciting the violent assault that took place at Mr. Calder's ranch 2 nights ago. An assault that left 2 of his hired men dead." The lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! This woman, this savage, has no standing. She is property." "She is a human being," Jonah said, his voice a low rumble. And she is a witness, Judge Thorne said, his voice cutting. He looked at Sachi, who had sat silent, her hands folded over her belly. Ma'am, can you speak our tongue? Sachi stood. The room held its breath. She was the spectacle they had come to see. She did not look at Pike. She looked at the judge. I can, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear as a bell. This man, Ransom Pike, the judge said, claims you are his ward, that he rescued you. Sachi's eyes flashed, a dark, hot fire. He did not rescue. He bought. He paid silver to the men who killed my mother. He chained me. She pointed to the shackle on the desk. That was my school. He and his men left me in a burned wagon. They left me for the vultures. This man. She turned and looked at Jonah, her voice softening. He cut the iron. He brought me water. He gave me a room, with a lock on the inside. The lawyer was spluttering. She is a liar, a heathen. She has bewitched him. This is not a marriage. It is our marriage, Sachi said, her voice rising, ringing with a fierce, cold pride. She put her hand on her own stomach. And this is our child. It was a bomb. The room erupted. The men in the back, who had come to see a scandal, now saw something else entirely. They saw a woman, a brave one, defending her home, defending her child. An old man in the back of the room, a tough rancher named Jed Moran, who had lost his own wife in childbirth 30 years prior, spoke up. His voice was like gravel. Judge, he called out, this has gone on long enough. I don't know this man Calderwell, but I know Pike, and I know a railroad land grab when I smell one. He looked at Sachi, his old, weathered eyes softening as he saw her condition. He looked at Jonah, a man clearly ready to defend his family. This ain't a matter of a writ. It's a matter of a child. Pike's claim is an offense. Your Honor, an offense to decency. Judge Thorne looked at the crowd. He saw no one on Pike's side. He saw a room full of hard men who, whatever their prejudices, respected a family. He looked at Pike's lawyer. This writ, Thorne said, picking it up, is based on fraud. It is invalidated by the testimony of Marshal Leland and the witness, and it is superseded by the clear and present facts of this new family. He tore the paper in half. A slow, deliberate sound. Case dismissed. Mr. Pike, you will remain in custody to face the criminal charges. Get him out. The room exhaled as one. It was over. Jonah and Sachi stood. The crowd parted for them, their faces no longer leering, but respectful, as they walked out into the cold, bright sun. Jed Moran tipped his hat to Sachi. It was a gesture of respect she had never seen from a white man. Their business was not quite done. Jonah walked, not to Comet, but to Dodd's general store. Sachi waited outside, a silent guard. Jonah walked in. The bell jingled. Ephraim Dodd, who had been peering out the window, flinched. Jonah, he stammered. I heard good news. Jonah walked to the counter. He was not angry. He was calm, and his calm was more terrifying than his rage had been. Ephraim, I need a 50-pound sack of flour, 20 pounds of salt, and a bolt of that soft, white cotton, the good kind, from the top shelf. Yes, of course. Jonah, right away. Dodd scrambled to get the items, his hands shaking. That last time, you see, with Harker, it was a miscalculation on the inventory. You see, Jonah put his money on the counter. It was exact. He did not bargain. He looked Dodd in the eye. Ephraim. Yes, Jonah. From now on, sell your goods. Do not weigh your prejudice. It is bad for business. Dodd nodded, pale, sweating. Yes, Jonah understood. Jonah took his supplies and walked out. He and Sachi loaded the mule. They rode out of Payson Crossing, not as a recluse and his captive, but as a family. The town watched them go. The silence that followed them down the creek was new. It was the sound of a law, unwritten but understood by all. Do not touch the Calder hive. Autumn deepened, turning the cottonwoods to brittle gold. and the legal battle of Payson Crossing faded into the quiet work of winter preparation. The new room was finished, the cradle was built. Sachi's body grew heavy, her movement slow, deliberate. They lived in a bubble of peace, a quiet rhythm of shared work and low conversation. The peace broke, as it always did. From the sky, winter came, not as a blanket, but as a hammer. A storm, darker and more violent than the one that had first brought them together, slammed into the valley. It was a night of pure, Arctic chaos. The wind shrieked, a high, thin sound of a soul being tortured. Sleet, not snow, hammered the roof, sounding like handfuls of gravel. And in the darkest hour, as a blast of thunder shook the cabin to its foundation, Sachi gasped. She clutched Jonah's arm, her eyes wide. "It is time," she said. Jonah, the surgeon, the man who had faced down gunmen, who had sat calmly in a hostile courtroom, felt his blood turn to ice. He sprang into action. He boiled water. He laid out the clean cotton. He helped her to the bed, the one he had built, the one he had shared with May. And that was his mistake. He saw Sachi, her face tight with the first pains, her dark hair spread on the pillow, and suddenly, he did not see her. He saw May. He saw her pale, sweat-soaked face. He heard the dry, hacking cough that had ripped her lungs apart. He smelled the metallic, sickly sweet scent of consumption, of death. He remembered holding May's hand as she died, helpless, his medical books, his surgical skill, all of it useless. The knife in his hand, the one he had sterilized to cut the cord, suddenly felt cold, impossibly heavy. He froze. His past, his failure, his profound, buried grief rose up and choked him. He was not a doctor. He was a widower. He was the man who watched his wife die. Sachi cried out, a low, sharp sound as another contraction seized her. She looked at him. She saw his face. He was not there. He was 1,000 miles away, in a graveyard, his hands shaking. She reached out, her hand weak, and grabbed his wrist. She grabbed the hand holding the knife. Her grip was like iron. "Jonah," she panted, her voice tight but fierce. "Look at me." He stared at her, his eyes wild, unseeing. "Jonah," she commanded. "This is not her. This is not that night. We were born in the storm. Remember now. Do your work." Her words cut through the fog. Do your work. It was the command of a soldier. It was the plea of a wife. He blinked. He saw her. Not May. Sachi. Her face slick with sweat. Her eyes clear and strong. Even in her pain. His wife. He dropped the knife. He took her hand, not as a grieving husband, but as the man who had sat on the floor and breathed with her. "Breathe with me, Sachi," he whispered, his voice shaking, but returning. "Breathe, as we did before." He was back. He was the doctor. He was the husband. He was the midwife. Clumsy, terrified, but resolute. The storm raged. The cabin was a small, fragile box in a world of howling chaos, and inside, a different, more primal, more powerful storm was at its peak. For hours, they worked. He held her. He coached her breathing. He was her anchor, as she was his. At the very peak of the storm, as the wind tore a shingle from the roof with a sound like a scream, and a single brilliant crack of lightning lit the world, Sachi bore down with a final, shuddering cry. The lightning flash was followed, an instant later, by a sound. Not the wind, not the thunder. A new sound. A thin, wet, furious wail. The storm outside paused, as if to listen. Jonah, his hands shaking, his entire body soaked in sweat, lifted the new life. He was sobbing, laughing, a sound as wild as the wind. It's a girl," he gasped. "Sachi, it's a girl." He wrapped her in the soft, clean cotton. He laid her on Sachi's breast. Sachi was exhausted, but her eyes were shining, brighter than the lightning. She touched the baby's face. She had a full, thick head of black hair. And when she opened her eyes, they were not brown, not blue, they were gray, storm gray, like her father's. "Nali?" Sachi whispered, her voice full of a weary, wondrous peace. "Nali," Jonah repeated. "What does it mean?" She smiled, touching her daughter's cheek. "In my language," she said, "it means the light that comes after the rain." Spring came to Tonto Creek not as a quiet request, but as a determined assertion. The snow on the Mogollon Rim, which had been a barrier of ice and memory, receded. The creek, fed by the melt, ran full and fast, a sound of vigorous, cleansing life. The great cottonwoods that lined the bank, skeletons for 4 hard months, were suddenly alive, veiled in a mist of the palest, most delicate green. Each new leaf, no bigger than a thumbnail, trembled in the warm breeze like a small, hopeful bell. The cabin yard was no longer a place of defense. It was a place of life. Jonah sat with his back pressed against the wide, rough trunk of the largest cottonwood, his long legs stretched out in the new grass. He was, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a man truly at rest. His shoulders were not tense, his eyes were not scanning the horizon for threats. They were half closed, his face turned to the sun. Sachi was nestled against him, her back to his chest, his arms wrapped loosely around her waist. She was watching the creek, her dark hair, unbound, spilling over his arm, in her lap, tucked into a sling of soft, white cotton. Nali slept. She was 3 months old, her face a perfect, serene miniature of her mother's, her breath a tiny, whisper-soft rhythm. Behind them, the cabin itself seemed to have exhaled. The door, which he had once kept barred, stood wide open. The new, east-facing window he had built was propped open, and the clean, bright air, smelling of wild mint and damp earth, moved through the small house, clearing out the last shadows of winter and fear. "The hives are strong," Jonah said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that vibrated through Sachi's back. "The bees are bringing in willow pollen. I will need to build 3, maybe 4 new boxes before the big summer flow." Sachi tilted her head back, her hair brushing his chin. "Good," she murmured, her voice soft with contentment. "More bees, and I will plant." "Plant what?" "Pumpkins, in that flat space, by the bee house. The earth is rich there. I will plant them when the moon is new. They will be good for the winter, for us." He smiled, a slow, easy smile that was no longer rusty. He rested his cheek on the top of her head. "Pumpkins," he agreed. "And corn. We'll have corn. The house is quiet," she said, her voice full of a faint wonder. Jonah knew exactly what she meant. The cabin was no longer a solitary man's box, filled with the ghosts of his past. The silence of fear, the silence of grief, the silence of loneliness, they were all gone. The house was now filled with new sounds, the gentle, rhythmic shush of the aspen cradle he had carved, the off-key, rumbling baritone of his own voice, singing the Chiricahua sleep song, and, in the mornings, when the sun streamed through the new window, the sudden, bright, bubbling laugh of their daughter. Sachi turned in his arms, a movement that was fluid and confident. She looked up at him, her storm-gray eyes, so like his own, shielded by her dark lashes. A slow, deeply playful, and utterly confident smile spread across her face. It was a smile he had never seen on the terrified girl under the wagon, or the fierce woman on the bluff. This was the smile of his wife, secure in her home. She raised a hand and traced a small, lazy circle on his shirt, right over his heart. "So," she whispered, her voice full of a teasing, secret knowledge. "So," he asked, his own smile matching hers. "White people," she said, her tone mock serious, her eyes bright with mischief. This is how you make children," he laughed. It was a full, deep, unguarded sound that startled a blue jay from the branches above. He remembered her, a wild, cornered creature in the dark, her eyes full of terror. He remembered her fever, her first, broken words. He remembered her standing in the courtroom, her hand on her belly, claiming him. He looked at her now, this beautiful, strong woman in his arms, the mother of his child. Her eyes alight with an intimate, teasing love. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not the desperate, anchoring kiss of the storm. It was a slow, gentle, sun-warmed kiss that tasted of certainty and the life they were building. One brick, one hive, one day at a time. "This," he said, pulling back, his voice rough with an emotion that still ambushed him. "This is how we make them. Together." She settled back against him, her smile content, profound. "Together," she agreed, her voice a soft echo, "is better." They sat in that peaceful silence for a long time, listening to the creek, the bees, and the breathing of their daughter. "She will learn," Sachi said quietly, her hand going to Nali's back, a small, instinctive gesture of protection. "Learn what?" "Everything." Sachi looked from the water to the sky, reading the high, thin clouds. "She will learn your words, your CUP, your letters, how to read your books." She looked up at the wisp of clouds. "And she will learn my words. She will learn to read the sky. She will know the rain before it comes. She will learn to listen to the earth when it speaks." "Yes," Jonah said, his voice thick. "Yes, she will." This had been their quiet agreement, forged in the long, dark nights of winter. While he carved the cradle and she sewed the tiny shirts, their daughter would not be half of one world, or half of another. Forced to choose, she would be whole. She would have 2 languages, 2 sets of stories. She would have the Chiricahua sleep song, and she would have the faded hymns from May's old, leather-bound book. She would have the precise, healing knowledge of the surgeon, and the ancient, earthy wisdom of the Apache. She was not a ward, a product of a chain or a fraudulent writ. She was a bridge. She was a child of free choice. A few days later, Marta Leland rode into the yard. She did not come with deputies, rattling with the law. She came alone, and she looked, for the first time, almost peaceful. She had left her gun belt in town. Jonah met her on the porch, Nali sleeping on his shoulder. Sachi stood beside him, no longer behind him. Called her, "Ma'am." Marta tipped her hat to Sachi, a gesture of deep, earned respect. "I just came from Prescott. The circuit judge is finished. It is done." Jonah felt the last knot of tension in his gut release. "Pike. His railroad friends," Marta said. "They cut him loose. He was an embarrassment, and his crimes were too public. He was found guilty. Trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy. He will be in Yuma for 20 years. He will not be seeing the sun." "And Harker?" Jonah asked, his voice low. "The judge," Marta said, a small, grim smile on her face. "Took one look at his new face, and then he took one look at her." She nodded to Sachi. He believed every word she said. "Harker got 10 years for assault and attempted kidnapping. He will not be coming back to this valley." It was over. The finality of it was a quiet, profound relief. Marta reached into her saddlebag. "And this, it's not much, but the territory has a new fund, for victims, for people, like you, ma'am, compensation. It is a stack of forms, legal papers." Jonah saw Sachi's face cloud over. The sight of official, scrawled papers, the tools of the law that had almost stolen her life, made her flinch. He saw her reaction and stepped forward, shifting Nali to his other arm. "We will fill them out. Marta, thank you for everything." Marta nodded, her eyes full of an understanding that went beyond words. "Good. You will need a witness for your signature. I will be back next week." She turned her horse and rode away, not as a marshal, but as a neighbor. Jonah took the papers inside. Sachi followed, her brow furrowed, her mistrust of the white man's ink still strong. "More paper," she said, her voice low and hard. "This paper is different," Jonah said. He sat her down at the table where he had first taught her to write cup. He took out the pen and the bottle of black ink. "This time, the words are yours. This time, the paper is your weapon. You will tell your story. All of it, the chain, the wagon, the silver pike paid. He took her hand, the one that had held the small knife on the bluff. "And I," he said, his voice soft, "I will be your hand. I will write the words for you. We will make the words stay, like you said." She looked at his hand, the one that had held a gun, the one that had carved the cradle. She looked at the pen. She nodded, a slow, determined gesture. "Good," she said. "We will make them stay." Later, the sun was streaming through the new, east-facing window. The light was golden, clear, and full of dust motes dancing. Nolly was awake, lying in her cradle, her gray eyes wide, taking in the world. Jonah had placed the 3 small whitewood carvings on the cradle's edge, where she could see them. The deer, for grace. The bee, for home. The horse, for freedom. Her small, fat hand, uncoordinated but endlessly curious, waved in the air. Her fingers, tiny and perfect, brushed against the small, carved deer. She stopped. She focused. She gurgled, a sound of pure, simple discovery. Outside the window, the bees, in their 4 new, humming hives, moved in and out, a tireless golden river. They were a low, steady, industrious sound, the sound of a home, working. That evening, the cabin was filled with the smell of stew and fresh-baked cornbread. The fire was lit, casting a soft, warm, orange glow over the room. Nolly was asleep in the aspen cradle, her breathing a faint, whispery sound in the quiet. Sachi was tired. She sat on the hearthstone, her head tilted back against the warm river stone of the chimney, her eyes closed. Jonah finished cleaning the last dish. He dried his hands, his rough, scarred, capable hands. He walked over to her. He stood for a long moment, just watching her, his wife, the mother of his child, the woman who had, with her quiet, fierce strength, saved him from the empty, haunted life he had been living. He held out his hand. She opened her eyes, looked at his hand, and placed hers in it. He pulled gently, supporting her as she stood. She was still healing, and he was infinitely tender with her. She rose, slowly, and he did not let go. He drew her in, not in a rush of passion, but in a slow, deliberate gathering. His hands moved to her waist, and she rested her hands on his chest, over his heart. They stood in the firelight, in the center of their home, not speaking, simply holding each other. It was an embrace that lasted a long, quiet minute. It was not about need, it was about presence. It was about the simple, profound, unbelievable fact that they were both still here, together, and safe. He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, deep, lingering kiss that held all the gratitude and love he had no words for. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a promise of nights without fear, of a future without chains. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. He moved one of his hands from her waist, covering her hand where it lay on his chest. His heart beat, steady and strong, beneath her palm. She moved her other hand, reaching out, her fingers brushing the smooth, pale, perfect wood of the cradle beside them. His hand over hers, on his heart, her hand on the cradle. They had their home. They had their future. They had each other. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from. We would love to connect and share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Stories 1850 channel, like this video, and give us your support by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people.